The evening air had a slight chill as Thomas Mitchell drove home through the quiet streets of Washington, D.C. The bare streetlights cast long shadows across his dark, blue sedan as he traveled the familiar route from FBI headquarters. It had been a long day of meetings, strategy sessions, and the mountain of paperwork that came with being the newly appointed FBI director. After 30 years of climbing through the ranks of federal law enforcement, Thomas had finally reached the pinnacle of his career just 3 weeks ago. Tonight, however, he was simply a tired man looking forward to getting home to his wife and a late dinner. Thomas adjusted his rearview mirror and noticed headlights approaching quickly from behind. He checked his speedometer, 42 in a 40 zone, and eased his foot off the gas pedal. The car behind him continued to close the distance, and then the familiar red and blue lights began to flash. Thomas sighed, signaled, and pulled his car to the curb, wondering what could have prompted the stop. He did everything by the book, turned off the engine, placed his hands on the steering wheel where they would be visible, and waited. The spotlight from the police cruiser made it impossible to see the approaching officers in his mirrors. Thomas took a deep breath and reminded himself to stay calm, a habit he'd developed over decades of dealing with tense situations. 2 officers approached, one on each side of the car. The taller one, with a buzz cut and a face that looked like it rarely smiled, shined his flashlight directly into Thomas's eyes. "License and registration," the officer demanded without any greeting. "Good evening, officer," Thomas said, his voice steady and respectful. "My license is in my wallet and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now if that's all right." The officer didn't respond, just kept the beam of light fixed on Thomas's face. The second officer, younger with a military-style haircut, stood watchfully at the passenger window. Thomas moved slowly, retrieving his wallet from his inner jacket pocket and then reaching for the glove compartment. He handed both items to the officer, who snatched them without a word. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" the officer finally asked, examining the license with obvious scrutiny. "No, sir, I don't. Was I speeding?" The officer handed the license to his partner. "You rolled through that stop sign back there on Maple Street," Thomas thought back. He was certain he'd come to a complete stop. "I apologize if that's the case, officer. I was sure I stopped completely." The younger officer handed the license back to his partner and whispered something Thomas couldn't hear. The first officer smirked. "Step out of the vehicle, please," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Thomas's heart rate increased slightly, but his face remained neutral. This was escalating quickly for what should have been a routine stop. "May I ask why that's necessary, officer?" "I'm happy to accept a citation if I violated a traffic law." "I said step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his hand moving to rest on his holster. "Now." Thomas complied, opening the door slowly and stepping out onto the pavement. The evening air felt colder now as he stood facing the 2 officers. His tailored suit, standard attire for the director, seemed to draw the officers' attention. "Pretty fancy suit for this neighborhood," the first officer commented, looking Thomas up and down. "What do you do for a living that lets you dress like that and drive a car like this?" "I work for the federal government," Thomas replied simply. The younger officer snorted. "Yeah? What are you, some kind of big shot?" Thomas kept his composure. "I work at the Justice Department," he said, not volunteering his exact position. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes less information was better, especially when he sensed potential bias. "Justice Department," the first officer repeated with exaggerated emphasis. "Well, excuse us for interrupting your important government business." He turned to his partner. "We got ourselves another important government official here, Jones." Officer Jones smiled thinly. "Seems like everyone in D.C. works for the government and thinks they're above the law." Thomas took a deep breath. "Officers, I respect the difficult job you have to do. If I rolled through a stop sign, I'll gladly accept the ticket. There's no need for this to become complicated." The first officer leaned in slightly. "You smell alcohol on your breath tonight, sir?" Thomas blinked in surprise. "No, I haven't had anything to drink." "Mind if we check that? I'm going to need you to take a breathalyzer test." Thomas stood his ground. "Officer, I've had nothing to drink today. I've been in meetings since 7 this morning." "Yeah, important government meetings, right?" Officer Jones chimed in. "Must be nice." The first officer, whose nameplate read Wilson, pulled out his breathalyzer. "Either you take the test or we can discuss this downtown." "Your choice." Thomas understood what was happening. He'd seen it before, had even given lectures on the subject of police conduct and bias. Now he was experiencing it firsthand despite his position, or perhaps because they couldn't see past his skin color to recognize his position. "I'll take the test," Thomas said quietly, "but I'd like to note that I don't believe there's reasonable suspicion for it." Officer Wilson smirked again. "Noted, now blow into this." Thomas complied, and as expected, the test showed 0 alcohol. Wilson looked almost disappointed as he put the device away. "Well, looks like you're not drunk, but I still need to run your information." Wilson walked back to the patrol car, leaving Thomas standing with Officer Jones. The silence stretched uncomfortably as they waited. A couple of cars drove by slowly, passengers rubbernecking at the scene of a well-dressed black man being detained by police. "Nice neighborhood you're heading to," Jones said eventually, breaking the silence. "You live around here?" "Yes," Thomas replied. "About 2 miles from here." "Must be doing pretty well at that government job," Jones remarked, his tone implying disbelief. Thomas didn't take the bait. He remained silent, waiting for Wilson to return. The minutes ticked by slowly. When Wilson finally came back, his demeanor had changed slightly. He looked Thomas over more carefully, but his tone remained dismissive. "There's an issue with your record," Wilson said. "We're going to need you to come to the station to sort it out." Thomas frowned. "What issue?" "My record is clean." "That's for us to determine at the station," Wilson replied. "You can either come voluntarily or we can make this official." Thomas weighed his options. He could identify himself as the FBI director right now, which would likely change the entire situation instantly, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the decades of training that taught him to observe and gather information before acting. Or perhaps it was the realization that what was happening to him tonight happened to countless others who didn't have his position or resources. "I'll come to the station," Thomas said finally, "but I want to call my wife to let her know I'll be late." Wilson shook his head. "You can call from the station. Jones will drive your car. I'll take you in the cruiser." Thomas felt a flare of indignation at the thought of a stranger driving his personal vehicle, but he suppressed it. "Is that really necessary?" "I'm cooperating fully. It's procedure," Wilson said with finality. "Turn around, hands behind your back." "Are you arresting me?" Thomas asked, his voice level despite his rising concern. "Just detaining you while we sort this out," Wilson replied. "Standard procedure." Nothing about this felt standard to Thomas, who had spent his entire career in law enforcement. But he complied, turning and placing his hands behind his back. The cool metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, tight enough to be uncomfortable. "This is unnecessary," Thomas said quietly as Wilson guided him toward the patrol car. "Everyone's a lawyer these days," Wilson muttered. "You Justice Department types are all the same." As Thomas was placed in the back seat of the patrol car, he watched Officer Jones get into his sedan. The young officer seemed to take a moment to appreciate the leather interior before starting the engine. Through the partition, Thomas could hear Wilson radio in. "Bringing in a 1053 for processing. Claims he works for justice. Wants special treatment." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. This wasn't about special treatment. This was about basic dignity and procedure. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, he thought about what would happen when they arrived at the station. Eventually, his identity would become clear. The question was, what would he do with that moment when it came? For now, though, he was just another black man in the back of a police car, being treated with suspicion and disrespect despite having done nothing wrong. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man they were treating this way oversaw the entire federal law enforcement apparatus of the United States. The patrol car turned onto the main road, heading toward the police station. Thomas Mitchell, FBI director, sat silently in the back seat, planning his next move carefully. This traffic stop had become something much more significant, a first-hand experience of the very issues he had been brought in to address. The police station buzzed with the usual evening activity, officers filing reports, phones ringing, and the occasional raised voice from the holding area. Officer Wilson guided Thomas through the front entrance, one hand firmly on his elbow despite Thomas's cooperative demeanor. The handcuffs bit into his wrists as they walked through the squad room, where several officers looked up from their desks. "Got a Justice Department hotshot here," Wilson announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Thinks stop signs don't apply to him." Thomas kept his face neutral despite the humiliation of being paraded through the station. He'd visited hundreds of police precincts during his career, but never like this. Never in handcuffs, never as a suspect. Officer Jones followed behind them, twirling Thomas's car keys around his finger. At the processing desk, a heavy-set desk sergeant looked up from his computer. His nameplate read Burnett. His eyes moved from Wilson to Thomas, taking in the handcuffs and Thomas's expensive suit with a raised eyebrow. "What have we got?" Sergeant Burnett asked, reaching for a booking form. Rolled through a stop sign, gave attitude, possible outstanding issue with his record, Wilson said. "Says he works for justice," Burnett smirked. "Another one? Must be a convention in town." Thomas stood straight, maintaining his dignity. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to make my phone call, please." "All in good time," Burnett replied, not looking up as he began to fill out the form. "Name? Thomas Mitchell. Date of birth?" Thomas provided the information, answering each question clearly and calmly. As the booking process continued, he noticed a younger officer watching from across the room. Unlike the others, this officer, Rodriguez, according to his nameplate, looked uncomfortable with the situation, occasionally glancing between Thomas and his colleagues with a furrowed brow. When Burnett finished the initial paperwork, he nodded to Wilson. "You can take the cuffs off now. Put him in interview room 2 while I run his info." Wilson removed the handcuffs and Thomas rubbed his wrists, relieved to be free of the restraints. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This way," Wilson said, gesturing toward a hallway lined with doors. "You'll get your call after we clear up this records issue." Thomas was led into a small room with a metal table bolted to the floor and 3 uncomfortable-looking chairs. The walls were bare except for a large mirror that Thomas knew was a one-way window. Standard interrogation room setup. He'd been on the other side of that glass countless times. "Have a seat," Wilson said. "Sergeant Burnett will be with you shortly." The door closed with a heavy click and Thomas was alone. He took a deep breath and rolled his shoulders, trying to release some tension. This situation was spiraling beyond a simple traffic stop, and he needed to decide how to handle it. As FBI director, one word from him would change everything. But was that the right move? What would that teach these officers? Thomas checked his watch, 9:47 p.m. His wife would be worried by now. They'd been married for 27 years, and he was rarely late without calling. She knew the risks of his job, even now when most of his work involved meetings rather than field work. The thought of her waiting, growing increasingly concerned, added to his frustration. Outside the room he could hear muffled voices, officers talking, laughing. Through the small window in the door, he caught glimpses of people walking past. No one seemed in a hurry to return to him. After 15 minutes, the door finally opened. Sergeant Burnett entered, followed by Wilson and Jones. Burnett carried a folder and wore an expression that suggested he was enjoying this a little too much. "So, Mr. Mitchell," Burnett began, dropping the folder on the table with a theatrical thump. "We've got a bit of a situation with your record." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "What situation would that be, Sergeant?" "Well, there's a flag on your name. Says you're connected to some pretty high-level government business." Burnett's tone made it clear he didn't believe this. "Care to explain that?" Thomas considered his response carefully. "I told the officers I work for the Justice Department." "That's accurate," Wilson snorted. "Yeah, and I'm the Attorney General." Jones laughed, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "Maybe he's CIA, that's why he can't tell us. It's classified." He made air quotes around the last word. "Look," Thomas said, his patience wearing thin but his voice remaining controlled. "This has gone far enough. I was pulled over for allegedly rolling through a stop sign. That's a simple traffic violation that typically results in a ticket. Instead, I've been handcuffed, brought to the station, and held for nearly an hour without being allowed to make a phone call. I'd like to resolve this situation now." Burnett exchanged glances with Wilson. "You'll get your call when we're good and ready. First, we need to clear up who exactly you are." "I've provided my identification," Thomas replied. "You have my driver's license, which is valid. You've presumably run my plates, which are registered to me. What more do you need?" Burnett opened the folder and made a show of flipping through it slowly. "Says here you have access to classified information. Says you work in a secured government facility." He looked up with exaggerated suspicion. "What exactly do you do at this Justice Department job of yours?" Thomas sat back in his chair. This was the moment. He could end this charade with one sentence. but something told him to wait. There was a lesson here, not just for these officers, but perhaps for himself as well. "I'm in a leadership position," he said simply. The three officers exchanged looks, and Jones actually laughed out loud. "Leadership position," he repeated mockingly. "Like what, you lead the coffee runs?" Through the window in the door, Thomas noticed Officer Rodriguez again, hovering nearby, clearly listening to the conversation. The young officer's discomfort seemed to have grown. "I'd like to make my phone call now," Thomas said firmly. "It's my right." "Rights," Wilson muttered. "Everyone's an expert on their rights these days." Burnett sighed dramatically. "Fine, one phone call. But make it quick." He pulled a landline phone from the corner of the room and placed it on the table in front of Thomas. "Who are you calling?" "Your lawyer." The way he said lawyer made it sound like a dirty word. "I'm calling my assistant," Thomas replied calmly, picking up the receiver. He dialed a number from memory and waited while it rang. The officers watched him with barely disguised amusement, clearly expecting nothing to come of the call. They didn't know that the number Thomas had dialed belonged to Diane Powell, his chief of staff at the FBI, who had direct access to every law enforcement agency in the country. "This is Powell," came the crisp, professional voice on the other end. "Diane, it's Thomas," he said, keeping his voice even. "I'm currently being held at the 7th Precinct in D.C. following a traffic stop. Could you please send someone to clarify my identity? And would you let Lisa know I'll be late?" Lisa was his wife, and Diane would understand the importance of that message. There was a brief pause on the other end. When Diane spoke again, her voice had a new edge to it. "Director Mitchell, are you saying you've been detained by local police?" Thomas could see the officers watching him, still smirking. "That's correct. Are you under arrest?" "No, there seems to be some confusion about my identity and position." Another pause. "I understand. I'll handle this immediately. Assistant Director Chen is still in the building. She'll be there within 15 minutes. "Thank you, Diane. That would be appreciated." Thomas hung up the phone and looked at the three officers. "Someone will be here shortly to clear this up." Burnett rolled his eyes. "Sure thing, big shot. We'll just wait for the Justice Department cavalry to arrive." He gestured to Wilson and Jones. "Let's let our VIP guest enjoy his accommodations while we finish the paperwork." As they left the room, Thomas heard Jones say, $10 says his assistant is his drinking buddy who's going to show up with bail money." The others laughed as the door closed. Alone again, Thomas straightened his tie and checked his watch. 15 minutes. He knew exactly what would happen when Assistant Director Chen arrived. The thought brought him no pleasure, only a deep sadness that such a lesson was necessary. Outside, he could see more activity through the door window. Officer Rodriguez was still nearby, looking increasingly agitated. The young officer seemed to be arguing with someone out of Thomas's line of sight. Time passed slowly in the small room. Thomas used the quiet moments to think about what this experience meant, not just for him personally, but for his role as FBI director. How many others faced similar treatment without the power to change the outcome? How many didn't have an assistant director of the FBI to call? The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders anew. At exactly 10:23 p.m., a commotion erupted in the squad room. Thomas couldn't see what was happening, but the increased voices and hurried footsteps told him Diane had been true to her word. Assistant Director Chen had arrived. The door to the interview room suddenly swung open, and Officer Rodriguez stood there, his face pale. Behind him, Thomas could see the entire station had gone eerily quiet. "Sir," Rodriguez said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there are people here for you." Thomas stood up, straightened his jacket, and nodded. "Thank you, Officer Rodriguez." As he walked out of the room, the atmosphere in the station had transformed completely. Standing in the middle of the squad room was Assistant Director Helen Chen, flanked by two stern-looking FBI agents in dark suits. Her expression was controlled but furious as her eyes found Thomas. "Director Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying through the silent room. "Are you all right, sir?" And just like that, every head in the precinct turned toward Thomas, faces showing various stages of shock and disbelief. Sergeant Burnett stood frozen by his desk, the color draining from his face. Officers Wilson and Jones stood nearby, their previous smugness replaced by something close to horror. Thomas straightened to his full height. No longer a suspect, but once again the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the country. I'm fine. Helen, he replied calmly, walking toward her. Thank you for coming. The silence in the room was deafening. The silence in the police station hung heavy in the air. Thomas could practically feel the shock radiating from every corner of the room. Assistant Director Helen Chen stood firmly in the center of the squad room, her presence commanding respect. The two FBI agents beside her remained expressionless, but their posture spoke volumes. They were ready for anything. Director Mitchell, Chen repeated, her voice cutting through the silence. We were concerned when you didn't arrive at your security details checkpoint. She glanced pointedly at the officers who had detained him. Had we known you were being entertained by local law enforcement, we would have arrived sooner. Thomas nodded, maintaining his composure despite the satisfaction he felt seeing the officers' reactions. A simple misunderstanding, Helen. The officers were just doing their job. The words tasted bitter, but Thomas knew better than to let emotion drive this moment. From across the room, Captain Richard Lee emerged from his office, clearly having been alerted to the commotion. He took in the scene with wide eyes, the FBI agents, the stunned officers, and Thomas standing calmly in the center of it all. What's going on here? He demanded, his gaze darting between Thomas and Chen. Chen turned to face him, her badge already in hand. Assistant Director Helen Chen, FBI. And this, she gestured toward Thomas, is Director Thomas Mitchell, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She let the words sink in before continuing. He was detained by your officers following a routine traffic stop. Captain Lee's face went through a rapid series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and finally, alarm. He turned to Thomas with a mixture of horror and embarrassment. Director Mitchell, I had no idea. There must be some mistake. Thomas straightened his tie, a habit from decades of maintaining composure in difficult situations. Captain Lee, I presume? I believe there has indeed been a mistake. Several, in fact. By now, Officers Wilson and Jones had backed away slightly, their earlier cockiness replaced by something resembling fear. Sergeant Burnett stood frozen at his desk, a half-completed form still in his hand. My car? Thomas asked quietly, looking directly at Officer Jones, who still had his keys. Jones stepped forward quickly, fumbling as he handed the keys back. Sir, we didn't know who you were. Thomas accepted the keys and pocketed them, his expression unchanged. That's precisely the issue, isn't it, Officer Jones? The way a person is treated shouldn't depend on their title. The younger officer, Rodriguez, who had shown discomfort throughout the ordeal, moved closer. Unlike his colleagues, he seemed more thoughtful than frightened. Sir, he said, his voice low but steady, I want to apologize for what happened tonight. Thomas studied Rodriguez for a moment, recognizing something in the young officer that reminded him of himself 30 years ago. Thank you, Officer Rodriguez. I appreciate that. Captain Lee, recovering his professional demeanor, stepped forward. Director Mitchell, please accept my deepest apologies on behalf of this precinct. I assure you this is not how we typically conduct ourselves. If you'll come to my office, we can discuss this privately and sort everything out. Thomas exchanged a glance with Chen, who raised an eyebrow slightly, a silent question about how he wanted to proceed. He gave her a subtle nod before turning back to the captain. I think that would be appropriate, Captain. Thomas agreed. Assistant Director Chen, would you join us? Of course, Director, Chen replied, motioning for the two FBI agents to wait in the squad room. As Thomas and Chen followed Captain Lee toward his office, the entire station remained unnaturally quiet. Officers pretended to return to their work while stealing glances at the FBI director, walking through their precinct. Thomas could feel their stares on his back, some curious, some fearful, some perhaps even resentful. Officer Wilson stepped forward suddenly, blocking their path. Sir, I want to explain. Not now, Wilson, Captain Lee snapped, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. It's all right, Thomas said, raising a hand. What did you want to say, Officer Wilson? Wilson's confident demeanor had completely vanished. He looked smaller somehow, uncertain. Sir, I was just following procedure. The computer showed a flag on your file. A flag that indicates high-level security clearance, Chen interrupted coldly. Not a reason for detention. Wilson swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. We didn't. We'll discuss this in detail later, Thomas said firmly. For now, I'd like to speak with your captain. Wilson nodded and stepped aside, his eyes fixed on the floor. As they continued toward the captain's office, Thomas noticed Rodriguez watching the exchange with an intensity that suggested he was taking mental notes. Captain Lee's office was small but tidy, with commendations and certificates covering one wall. He quickly cleared 2 chairs for Thomas and Chen before closing the door. The sudden quiet was a relief after the tension of the squad room. Director Mitchell, Lee began, remaining standing behind his desk. I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this incident. Had you known I was the FBI director, I would have been treated differently. Thomas finished for him. That's precisely what concerns me, Captain. Lee's face reddened. Sir, that's not what I meant, isn't it? Thomas asked quietly. Tell me, would your officers have handcuffed a white man in a suit for allegedly rolling through a stop sign? Would they have brought him to the station, mocked him, and delayed his phone call? Lee opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly unsure how to answer. Chen leaned forward slightly. The director's driver's license and registration were valid. His vehicle was properly registered. There were no warrants. The security flag on his file indicates federal clearance, not criminal activity, yet he was detained for over an hour. I understand how this looks, Lee said carefully. But I assure you, race had nothing to do with it. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Then what did it have to do with, Captain? Help me understand. Lee shifted uncomfortably. Sometimes officers can be overzealous. Overzealous, Thomas repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Is that what we're calling it now? A knock at the door interrupted them. Lee called for the person to enter, perhaps grateful for the distraction. It was Officer Rodriguez holding a USB drive. Sorry to interrupt, Captain, Rodriguez said, but I thought this might be relevant to your discussion. He placed the USB drive on the desk. It's the body camera footage from Officers Wilson and Jones during the traffic stop and booking process. Lee looked surprised. Rodriguez, this isn't the time. Actually, Thomas interjected, I think it's exactly the time. He looked at Rodriguez with new interest. Thank you, officer. Rodriguez nodded. Sir, not everyone here. He paused, searching for the right words. What happened tonight doesn't represent all of us. After Rodriguez left, closing the door behind him, Chen picked up the USB drive. We'll want to review this footage, Captain. Lee nodded, resignation settling on his features. Of course. And Director Mitchell, whatever disciplinary action you feel is appropriate. I haven't decided what action is appropriate yet. Thomas interrupted. This isn't about punishment, Captain. It's about addressing a systemic problem. Lee's expression shifted to confusion. Sir? Thomas stood up, straightening his jacket. What happened to me tonight happens to countless citizens who don't have my position or resources. The difference is I can do something about it. Chen nodded in agreement, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She had worked with Thomas long enough to know where this was heading. I don't want Officers Wilson and Jones fired, Thomas continued. That would be the easy way out. It would allow everyone to pretend the problem was solved when 2 bad apples were removed. Then what do you want? Lee asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Change, Thomas said simply. Real, meaningful change. And it starts with accountability. Lee seemed to consider this. What are you suggesting, Director? I'll have my office contact you tomorrow to discuss next steps, Thomas replied. For now, I'd like my personal effects returned, and I'd like to go home to my wife, who is undoubtedly worried. Of course, Lee said quickly, standing up. I'll personally see to it. As they walked back into the squad room, Thomas noticed the atmosphere had changed again. Word had spread throughout the station about who he was, and officers were now giving him a wide berth, their expressions a mixture of shame, fear, and curiosity. Sergeant Burnett approached with a plastic bag containing Thomas's wallet and phone. Your belongings, sir, he said stiffly, avoiding eye contact. Thank you, Sergeant, Thomas replied, accepting the bag. He turned to Chen. I think I'll drive myself home, Helen. But I'd appreciate it if you could have someone pick up my car tomorrow for a security check. Chen nodded. Already arranged, sir. And Director Rivera has been briefed on the situation. He sends his regards and says the Oversight Committee will be very interested in tonight's events. Thomas suppressed a smile at the mention of the FBI's Internal Oversight Committee. It was a reminder that even in this humiliating situation, he wasn't powerless. As they walked toward the exit, Officer Rodriguez approached once more. Director Mitchell, he said, his voice low, I just wanted to say, What happened tonight isn't right. Not to anyone, regardless of who they are. Thomas studied the young officer thoughtfully. How long have you been on the force, Officer Rodriguez? 3 years, sir. And what made you become a police officer? Rodriguez straightened slightly. To help people. To make a difference. Thomas nodded, seeing the sincerity in the young man's eyes. That's a good reason. Hold on to that. He handed Rodriguez a business card from his wallet. If you ever want to make a bigger difference, give my office a call. Rodriguez accepted the card with wide eyes, clearly stunned by the gesture. As Thomas and Chen stepped outside into the cool night air, the weight of the evening's events settled fully on Thomas's shoulders. He was exhausted, but his mind was already racing with plans and possibilities. You're being very calm about all this, Chen observed as they walked toward his car. Thomas looked back at the precinct building. Getting angry wouldn't solve anything, Helen, but using what happened to create meaningful change. That might, Chen smiled. That's why you're the director. Thomas unlocked his car and paused before getting in. Have Deputy Director Reynolds meet me first thing tomorrow. We have work to do. As Thomas drove away from the precinct, he couldn't help but think about how differently the evening might have gone for someone without his resources and position. That thought, more than the personal humiliation he had endured, strengthened his resolve to turn this incident into something positive. The revelation of his identity had changed everything tonight. Now it was time to see if it could change things for others as well. Morning light streamed through the windows of Thomas Mitchell's office at FBI headquarters. He stood looking out at the Washington skyline, coffee cup in hand, reflecting on the previous night's events. The humiliation, the anger, the revelation, all of it still felt fresh. His wrists still bore faint marks from the handcuffs. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called. Turning from the window, Deputy Director Anthony Reynolds entered, carrying a tablet and a thick folder. A tall man with salt and pepper hair and glasses, Reynolds had been Thomas's right-hand man since his appointment as FBI director. Their history went back 20 years to when they were both field agents. Morning, Thomas, Reynolds said, noting the dark circles under his friend's eyes. Rough night? Thomas gave a short, humorless laugh. You could say that. I reviewed the body camera footage, Reynolds said, his expression grim. It's worse than I imagined. If that had been anyone else. But it wasn't anyone else, Thomas replied. It was the FBI director, and that's exactly the problem. He gestured for Reynolds to sit at the small conference table in the corner of the office. What's the status of Officers Wilson and Jones? Reynolds consulted his tablet. Captain Lee placed them on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The press hasn't caught wind of the incident yet, but it's only a matter of time. Thomas nodded. He had expected as much. And Officer Rodriguez? Still on active duty. According to his file, he's got a clean record. 3 years on the force. Graduated top of his class at the academy. His supervisors note he's thoughtful and shows good judgment, though Wilson wrote in his last performance review that he sometimes hesitates to act decisively. Reynolds looked up from the tablet. Reading between the lines, I'd say Wilson thinks Rodriguez isn't aggressive enough. Or perhaps Rodriguez actually considers the consequences of his actions, Thomas mused. He took another sip of coffee. What about the 7th precinct overall? What's their record like? Reynolds opened the folder and spread several papers on the table. Above average complaints for excessive force and racial bias, below average resolution rates. They've had 3 civil suits in the past 2 years, all settled out of court. Nothing that would raise major red flags in isolation. But when you look at the pattern, he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Thomas reviewed the documents, noting specific incidents and names that appeared multiple times. Burnett and Wilson both appear in several complaints. Yes, Reynolds confirmed. But they've never faced serious consequences. The usual slaps on the wrist, mandatory training, nothing substantial. That changes now, Thomas said firmly. He stood and began pacing, energy returning to his tired frame. I've been thinking about this all night, Anthony. What happened to me was unacceptable, but it's not unique. The difference is I have the power to do something about it. Reynolds leaned back in his chair. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we use this incident as a catalyst for change. Not just at the 7th precinct, but across the department. Thomas paused, organizing his thoughts. I want a comprehensive review of their policies, procedures, and training. I want a close look at their complaint resolution process, and I want oversight. Real oversight, not just paperwork. That's going to ruffle some feathers, Reynolds warned. The police union won't take kindly to FBI interference. This isn't interference, Thomas countered. This is accountability, and I'm not stopping there. Before Reynolds could respond, there was another knock at the door. Assistant Director Chen entered, her usual composed self despite the early hour. Director, Deputy Director, she greeted them. I thought you should know, the story's leaked. It's hit social media and several news outlets are calling for comment. Thomas sighed. It was inevitable. But he had hoped for more time to prepare. What's the narrative? Chen handed him her phone, showing a news alert from a major network. FBI director detained by local police in apparent racial profiling incident. It gets worse, Chen said, scrolling to show more headlines. Some outlets are calling for immediate firing of the officers involved. Others are questioning whether this shows systemic issues in both local police and federal law enforcement oversight. And some are probably suggesting I'm playing the race card, Thomas added, handing the phone back. Chen nodded reluctantly. There's that too. Reynolds stood up. We need to get ahead of this. Issue a statement, schedule a press conference. No, Thomas interrupted. No press conference, not yet. A brief statement acknowledging the incident occurred, that it's under review, and that I'll address it fully at the appropriate time. The longer you wait, the more speculation will build, Chen cautioned. I know, but I'm not going to rush this just to satisfy the news cycle. This is too important. Thomas walked back to his desk and pressed the intercom. Diane, could you come in, please? A moment later, Thomas's chief of staff entered the office. Diane Powell had a reputation for efficiency and discretion that made her invaluable in her role. I need a few things, Thomas told her. First, contact Captain Lee at the 7th Precinct. Tell him I want a meeting today, if possible, with him and his command staff. Second, reach out to Officer Luis Rodriguez. Invite him to attend separately. And third, see if the Attorney General is available for lunch. Diane nodded, making notes. Anything else? Yes. Call my wife and tell her I'll likely be late again tonight. After Diane left, Reynolds gave Thomas a questioning look. The Attorney General? You're taking this to DOJ level? This isn't just about one incident, Anthony. This is about using my position to address a problem that affects thousands of Americans every day. Thomas sat back down at the conference table. I spent the night thinking about how differently things would have gone if I hadn't been FBI director. What if I was just Thomas Mitchell, accountant? Or Thomas Mitchell, teacher? Would I have spent the night in a cell? Would there be charges filed against me? How would it have affected my life, my career, my family? Chen took a seat at the table. You can't solve systemic racism with one case, Thomas. You know that. I don't expect to solve it, Thomas replied, but I can use what happened to shine a light on it. I can use my position to start a conversation and push for real change. The officers will likely face disciplinary action, Reynolds pointed out. Possibly termination, given the publicity. Thomas shook his head. That's not what I want. Firing Wilson and Jones doesn't fix anything. It just makes them someone else's problem and lets the department pretend they've addressed the issue. So what do you want? Chen asked, genuinely curious. Thomas smiled slightly. I want them to learn. I want the department to learn, and I want to use this as an opportunity to push for broader reforms. He turned to Reynolds. How quickly can we put together a training program on bias and proper procedure? Reynolds considered the question. We have existing materials. With some customization, maybe a week? Make it 3 days, Thomas replied. And I want to be involved personally. Chen raised an eyebrow. You want to teach the class yourself? Director, with all due respect, is that the best use of your time? For this? Yes. Thomas's voice was firm. There's power in having the FBI director, the man they detained and mocked, stand in front of them and address what happened. Not with anger or punishment, but with a focus on improvement and change. A brief silence fell over the room as Chen and Reynolds considered his words. There's something else, Thomas added. I want to start a task force on police reform. Not just reactive investigations when something goes wrong, but proactive work to prevent these incidents in the first place. Better training, clearer guidelines, real consequences for violations, and support for officers who do the right thing. Like Rodriguez, Reynolds noted. Exactly like Rodriguez, Thomas agreed. We need to recognize and elevate officers who understand that their job is to protect and serve everyone, not just those who look a certain way or come from certain neighborhoods. The intercom buzzed. "Director?" Diane's voice came through. "Captain Lee is available at 2 p.m. today. Officer Rodriguez can come at 3:30, and the Attorney General can do lunch at 12:30. "Thank you, Diane," Thomas replied. He looked at his colleagues. "It's going to be a busy day." Reynolds gathered his papers. "What do you need from us?" "Helen," Thomas turned to Chen, "I want you to prepare a detailed report on the 7th Precinct's record. Everything we have. Complaints, lawsuits, commendations, the works. And Anthony, start putting together that training program. I want something comprehensive but practical." As they stood to leave, Thomas added, "One more thing. This isn't about retribution. I'm not looking to destroy careers or publicly shame these officers. This is about creating meaningful change, about making sure what happened to me doesn't keep happening to others who don't have my resources or position." Chen nodded. "Understood." When they had gone, Thomas turned back to the window looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, Officers Wilson and Jones were probably dreading what would happen next. Captain Lee was likely preparing for the worst, and Officer Rodriguez might be wondering if his actions would cost him his career. Thomas's phone buzzed with a news alert. FBI Director to address police detention incident. Sources say reform initiatives coming. The news was moving faster than he'd anticipated. But perhaps that was for the best. Change rarely came without pressure, without a moment that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. As FBI Director, Thomas had the power to shine a spotlight on those truths, and he intended to use it. His intercom buzzed again. "Director," Diane said, "the Attorney General's office called back. He'd like to move lunch earlier if possible. He says this is a priority." Thomas smiled. The momentum was building already. "Tell him I'll be there," he replied. "And Diane? Thanks for last night. Your quick action made a difference." "Just doing my job, sir," she responded, but he could hear the smile in her voice. Thomas sat down at his desk and began making notes for his meetings. This wasn't how he had planned to push for police reform, but sometimes the most powerful catalysts for change came from unexpected places. In this case, from a routine traffic stop that had been anything but routine. 2 weeks had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the community center near the 7th Precinct, casting long strips of light across the room. Thomas Mitchell stood at the front, watching as police officers filed in, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension to outright resentment. Today was the first day of the new training program, a comprehensive course on unconscious bias, proper procedure, and community relations. But this wasn't just any training. This was personal. Thomas spotted Officer Wilson near the back, his face a careful mask of neutrality. Next to him sat Officer Jones, who couldn't quite hide his discomfort. Sergeant Burnett had positioned himself near the door as if planning a quick escape. And there in the second row was Officer Rodriguez, attentive and ready. Captain Lee entered last, nodding respectfully to Thomas before taking a seat. The room quieted as Thomas stepped to the podium. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and clear. "For those who don't know me, I'm Thomas Mitchell, Director of the FBI." A murmur ran through the room, though most already knew exactly who he was. The incident had been front-page news for days. 2 weeks ago, I was pulled over a few blocks from here, allegedly for rolling through a stop sign. Thomas paused, letting the words sink in. What followed was an experience that was unfortunately all too common for many Americans, particularly those who look like me. He could see some officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others remained stoic, giving nothing away. "I'm not here to shame anyone," Thomas continued. "I'm not here to point fingers or demand terminations. I'm here because what happened that night revealed problems that go beyond individual actions, problems that affect how communities view law enforcement and how law enforcement views communities." Thomas stepped out from behind the podium, choosing to stand closer to the officers. "Let me be clear, this is not anti-police. I've spent my entire career in law enforcement. I believe in the vital role police play in our society. But I also believe that with great power comes great responsibility, and part of that responsibility is to continuously examine and improve how we do our jobs." He picked up a remote and clicked it, bringing up the first slide, a simple image showing a split screen of the 7th Precinct building and FBI headquarters. Our agencies have different jurisdictions, different responsibilities, but we share a common mission: to protect and serve the public. All of the public. Thomas clicked to the next slide, which showed statistics on racial disparities in traffic stops, arrests, and use of force incidents. These numbers tell a story, he said, not of individual racism necessarily, but of systemic patterns that have real impacts on real people. People like me who wonder if they're being stopped because of an actual violation or because of how they look. He could see Wilson staring at the floor now, avoiding eye contact. Jones was looking straight ahead, his jaw tight. Rodriguez was taking notes. Today is the first day of a new program, one that I've helped design specifically for this precinct. Over the next week, we'll be diving into these issues together. We'll look at case studies, examine best practices, and most importantly, we'll talk honestly about the challenges you face and how to meet them while treating everyone with dignity and respect. Thomas set down the remote and looked around the room. But before we begin, I'd like to share something personal. The night I was detained, I had a choice to make. I could have immediately identified myself as FBI director. I could have pulled rank and avoided the entire experience. But I didn't, because I wanted to see how I would be treated as just another black man in America. The room was completely silent now, all eyes on Thomas. What I experienced was revealing and painful, but it also gave me an opportunity that most people in my position don't get. A first-hand reminder of what it feels like to be on the other side of the badge when things go wrong. Thomas walked to the center of the room, closing the distance between himself and the officers. I'm not here for an apology. I'm here for change. Real, lasting change that benefits both law enforcement and the communities you serve. He nodded to someone at the back of the room, and the door opened. Assistant Director Chen entered, followed by several community leaders, including pastors, school principals, and neighborhood advocates. This morning, we'll be joined by members of the community, Thomas explained. People who live and work in the neighborhoods you patrol. People who want the same things you do: safety, respect, and understanding. Thomas gestured to the newcomers. These community leaders have agreed to participate in today's session, to share their perspectives and experiences. And in the coming weeks, officers from this precinct will be attending community events, not as security but as participants. As listeners, Captain Lee stood up. Director Mitchell has worked with me to develop this program. It's not punitive, it's educational. And I expect everyone to participate fully and respectfully. His gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on Wilson and Jones. As the community leaders found seats throughout the room, Thomas returned to the podium. We'll start with something simple but powerful: introductions. I'd like each of you to share your name, how long you've been in law enforcement, and one thing you hope to gain from this training. The next hour was uncomfortable but productive. Some officers spoke candidly about their challenges and frustrations. Others were more guarded. The community members shared stories of both positive and negative interactions with police. When it was Wilson's turn, he stood reluctantly. Officer David Wilson, 12 years on the force. He paused, clearly struggling with the next part. I hope to... He looked directly at Thomas for the first time. I hope to better understand how my actions affect others. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. Jones followed with a similar statement, though his seemed more rehearsed, less genuine. Burnett grumbled something about improving community relations. When Rodriguez stood, his voice was clear and confident. Officer Luis Rodriguez, 3 years with the department. I hope to learn how to be a better advocate for change within the system. Thomas nodded approvingly. In the 2 weeks since the incident, he'd met with Rodriguez several times. The young officer had valuable insights and a genuine desire to improve policing in his community. Thomas had already flagged him for potential recruitment to the FBI's new police reform task force. By noon, the initial tension in the room had eased somewhat. The officers had broken into small groups, each including a community member, discussing specific scenarios and how they might be handled differently. Thomas stood with Chen and Captain Lee, observing the interactions. It's a good start, Chen commented quietly. Just a start, Thomas agreed. Real change takes time and consistent effort, Lee nodded. The department's watching this program closely. If it shows results here, they're talking about implementing it citywide. That's the goal, Thomas replied. To create something sustainable that outlasts the news cycle of my particular incident. His phone buzzed with a message from Reynolds. Task force approvals came through. Green light from DOJ and Oversight Committee. Thomas smiled slightly, tucking the phone away. The pieces were falling into place. What had begun as a humiliating and infuriating experience was transforming into something productive, a catalyst for real change. After lunch, Thomas led a session on unconscious bias, sharing research and real-world examples. As he spoke, he noticed Wilson watching him intently, something shifting in the officer's expression. Not quite remorse, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Later, as the day's session wound down, Rodriguez approached Thomas. Director Mitchell, I wanted to thank you for how you've handled this whole situation. It would have been easy to just demand firings and move on. Thomas nodded. The easy solution isn't always the right one, Officer Rodriguez. Changing a culture is harder than changing personnel. I've been thinking about your offer, Rodriguez continued. The task force position. And? I want to help make a difference, Rodriguez said simply. If you think I can do that better on your task force than in my current role, then I'm in. Thomas extended his hand. Welcome aboard. We start next month. As the officers filed out at the end of the day, Thomas noticed Wilson hanging back. Finally, when almost everyone had left, the officer approached. Director, Wilson began awkwardly. I just wanted to say, that night. It wasn't right how we treated you. Thomas studied him for a moment. No, it wasn't. The question is, would you have treated anyone else differently? Wilson looked away. I'd like to think so, but I don't know. Maybe not. That's an honest answer, Thomas replied. And honesty is where change begins. Wilson nodded and left without another word. Thomas gathered his materials, reflecting on the day. It hadn't been perfect. Some officers had participated only reluctantly, others seemed genuinely engaged. The community members had shown remarkable courage in sharing their experiences. Outside, the evening was pleasant as Thomas walked to his car. His security detail, reinstated after the incident, followed at a respectful distance. As he drove away from the community center, he passed the spot where he'd been pulled over 2 weeks earlier. So much had changed since that night. The 7th Precinct was under intensive review. The training program was underway. The police reform task force was becoming reality. And across the country, people were talking about the incident, about what it revealed, and about what needed to change. Thomas knew that one training program wouldn't solve generations of mistrust and systemic problems. One task force couldn't transform policing overnight. One incident, even involving the FBI director, wouldn't erase countless similar experiences that never made the news. But it was a beginning, a step toward accountability, toward understanding, toward change. As he headed home, Thomas thought about the young man he had once been, an idealistic rookie agent who believed he could make a difference. Today, that idealism had been tempered by experience, but the core belief remained. Change was possible. It started with one person, one precinct, one honest conversation at a time. And Thomas Mitchell, FBI director and ordinary citizen, was determined to see it through.